Good afternoon. Welcome to the panel discussion co-hosted by the Oxford Energy Society and European Young Engineers. Today, we will focus on the International Energy Agency's recent net zero report, aiming to unpack the targets and strategies outlined by the report and discuss the steps required for achieving them. But before that, we will let the hosting organizations introduce themselves.
Thank you, Nadia. So my name is Gregory. I'm the Vice President of European Young Engineers Public Policy Department. We call our organization EYE. And EYE is actually a non-profit organization that represents around 500,000 young engineers across 30 plus national engineering member organizations. And we do have one working group focused on energy and environment in EYE public policy that aims to make the voice of young engineers heard on questions related to energy, environment, and climate action, and promoting policies that are consistent with our vision of a sustainable future in Europe. On the other side, we are organizing this event with the Oxford Energy Society, which is a vibrant student-run society dedicated to providing a platform for stimulating discussion and understanding in energy technology and finance, energy crisis, and climate change. They do host weekly events on Wednesday afternoons during term times to bring cutting edge research and experts' opinions regarding energy development to students and the wider community. You can find a link to our websites in the description sections on YouTube and Facebook. Please do subscribe to our channels and Facebook pages as well if you're interested in future events, which we host throughout the year. Thank you.
Nadia, would you like to go ahead?
So we have had the honor to invite researchers from different departments within the University of Oxford to provide us with a comprehensive examination of the IEA report. We wanted to look at the net zero scenarios from perspectives including policy, community participation, technology, and whole system analysis. Our panelists include Professor Nick Eyre, Director of Center for Research into Energy Demand Solutions, and the Advisor on Climate Change to the Oxford City Council. Dr. Catherine Collett, an Oxford Engineering Department researcher specializing in cross-disciplinary challenges associated with transitions such as electric vehicles and clean energy sources. Dr. Sivapriya, also called Priya, Bhagavati, a whole system manager at SSE Transmission and a researcher focusing on energy transition, interweaving technology, regulation, and policy paradigms. And last but not least, Dr. Colin Nolan, researcher in the politics of energy demand, specializing in the intersection between communities, demand, mobility, and climate change. Unfortunately, Dr. Susan Stritzker, who specializes in energy finance and electrification strategies in Africa, cannot join us today. But if you have any questions for her, please feel free to email us at events@oxfordenergysociety.com or publicpolicy@eyengineers.eu. The bios of all our speakers are available in the discussion section on our Facebook events page. In addition, we are excited to announce that Professor Jonathan Stern, one of the peer reviewers of this IEA report, will deliver the keynote speech for today's session. Professor Stern is the founder and ex-director of the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies Gas Research Program, as well as the author of many books focusing on natural gas and the energy transition. If you have any questions for Professor Stern or any other speakers, please feel free to put them in the comment section on YouTube or Facebook. We will take them collectively during the audience Q&A section at the end, which will be led by Anlin Chen. Now, without further ado, I will hand over to Professor Stern for the keynote speech.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm hoping that you will be able to see in a few minutes. Hang on just a second. Sorry, minor problem. I ought to be able to see my presentation.
If you like, I could share the screen for you.
Okay, I'm sorry that for some reason this looks like it's not going to work from my system, which is disappointing. But in which case, and if you could put up the presentation, that would be great.
Yeah, just one sec.
Just a second. I may have it. Hold on a second.
Okay, cool.
Okay, are you able to see that now?
Yes. Okay.
I'll put it on. I'll put it on full screen. Okay, is that okay for everybody?
Yeah, I think that looks good.
Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation. I should just say one thing to give you a little bit more context about myself. I'm not principally a UK energy researcher, although obviously our unit is based in Oxford. I've mainly done most of my research outside the UK, in Europe, but also in big fossil fuel producing and importing countries around the world. And that has led me towards the IEA and their publications. What I thought I would try to do in a very short space of time, because this is a report of well over 200 pages, is focus on the topics that you've got on the screen here. And the 4 sections that I've separated my comments into. I'm going to show you slides from the study itself and make some comments on that. Now, of course, the study is very long, and I'm really only trying to hit highlights of even a few of the issues that it raises. But if you take a look at the quote at the bottom of this slide, you'll see that not everyone has received this study particularly, shall we say, either politely or in a welcome frame of mind. So without further ado, let me try and say what I think this study is, and critically what it is not, because many of the criticisms, I think, are aimed at something that the IEA was not intending to do. The IEA was requested to provide a study prior to COP26 to show how to reach net zero emissions by 2050. But this is one net zero pathway. It is not the only net zero pathway that meets the requirements. But it's based on the IEA's World Energy Outlook and energy technology models. And critically, in terms of what it is not, this is not a projection of what will happen. It is an illustration, only one illustration, of what needs to happen if net zero by 2050 is to be achieved. And in that spirit, it's not clear whether its critics, and there have been many, are saying either that net zero by 2050 is impossible, or that somehow the IEA modeling has taken a wrong pathway, and that there are many other options which would reach the same outcome with a very different set of parameters. One of the problems, which you will notice in my slides, one of the problems with the study that I have pointed out to the agency several times, is that there is no regional granularity to the projections and the scenarios. In other words, they divide the world into advanced and emerging and developing economies. So there is no sense of what the burden sharing would be for Europe, or indeed for any single other country. And that's a problem, but one that we will have to live with until they see fit to remedy it. So let me dive into this, and I'm going to throw a lot of information at you very quickly because of time, but hopefully you'll have a chance to take a look at the study itself if you want more details. So pledges and policy requirements. Essentially what the study looks at is, here are the countries that have made net zero pledges, about 25% of the world, mostly advanced countries, about 40% of the world's population, covering about 75% of CO2 emissions and about 70% of GDP. Now, this next slide is difficult for you to read on the screen, but I've put it up because I think it's incredibly important to look at the different milestones. Obviously, I'm not going to read all of these out, and hopefully if you press your nose to the screen, you can read at least some of them. But let me point out just a few. On the left-hand side of the screen, and perhaps the most controversial and well-advertised conclusion is no new unabated coal plants and no new oil and gas fields approved for development. Just above those two in 2025, you'll see no new sales of fossil fuel boilers, somewhat controversial in the UK this week, given what we understand the government is considering. Just going to the bottom of the slide, you'll see 150 million tons of low carbon hydrogen and 850 gigawatts of electrolyzers by 2030, increasing to 435 million tons and 3,000 gigawatts. And then, which I'll come back to in a little bit, 4 gigatons of CO2 sequestration by 2035, rising to 7.6 billion tons, and so on and so on. All sorts of things about global car sales, for example, having to reach 60% around 2030, all sorts of things. But the key thing here is that if the world misses these milestones, and particularly if it misses the 2030 milestones, there is very limited opportunity to catch up after that. And this is why the modeling has to be really carefully done, because it's not a question of doing very little for 20 years and then saying, well, we'll do everything in the last decade up to 2050, because you'll have broken the carbon budget by then. And anyway, the lead times probably mean you won't make it in any case. So let me just look at some average CO2 reductions. What I think is interesting here, and I'll come back to that as well, is the influence of behavior and avoided demand is relatively small. The impact of efficiency and electrification are the key issues here, and particularly, of course, wind and solar. Down right at the bottom, you see CCUS, which is relatively minor until we get to the late 2030s, but in fact, relatively minor in any case. Thought I'd just put up this slide on CO2 prices. For those of you who don't follow this in great detail, in Europe we're above 50 euros a ton, which is a bit more than that in dollars. But you can see how these have to increase very considerably as we move through the decades, and also involve emerging and developing economies where we haven't seen a great deal of a movement here, apart from maybe in China. The bottom two charts I thought were important because you can see how far we have to achieve, even by 2030, in CO2, absolute CO2 emissions reductions and per capita. In other words, we have to be at least halfway there towards the 2050 target by 2030. And that seems to me to be, given 2030 is not really that far away, pretty significant pretty significant achievement if we're gonna make that, and we need to get going much more quickly. So let's move on and talk briefly about energy consumption. This slide, it does what you would absolutely expect. In other words, it shows how you move from the world moves from fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal, and traditional biomass to a much more electricity-based energy balance with solar PV, wind, and notice in the bottom set of bars, nuclear increases a little bit, but not that much. And the amount of unabated fossil fuels also, there's still a reasonable amount there until we get to 2040. So basically here you're looking at how the world has to change its final energy consumption in a world where energy demand in general is increasing. For the three fossil fuels, gases do by far the best. Coal has to be phased out very, very quickly, replaced by a lot by modern bioenergy. Oil peaks last year, moves down to 2030, and again some bioenergy there, but oil very quickly reduces, particularly with the reduction of liquid fuels in transport. Gases pretty much stay similar during this decade and then decrease significantly, and that's when hydrogen and some of the other conversions come into the picture. For the exporting countries, this is not, as you will hear many times, a disaster for Middle East oil producers, because they have by far the lowest cost of production. In fact, the OPEC countries do pretty well for an oil sector which is declining rapidly in demand. Bit more worrying for natural gas exporters is the peaking in the next few years of LNG exports, liquefied natural gas, and the absolutely crashing decline, which would make you wonder why so many countries are investing in new LNG projects still today. This is an important slide because it underpins a lot of what I've been showing you. Only the low-cost fossil fuel producers are going to survive. This is a slightly complex chart to show now for any of you who are familiar with fossil fuel prices. In 2020, they were extremely low. Today they are much higher. So crude oil is around $70 a barrel. Natural gas prices, you can see the European Union at 2. This week it's at more than $15, and so are some of the other countries. And coal, I had a look at coal, and you see it in, for example, in the European Union, it was between $140 and $150 last week. So bit of a difficult issue with price volatility of fossil fuels, but this is really the projection for countries that they need to look at because of the reduction in demand for the products. And what this tells you is in the income that it's the oil producers that are really going to suffer. The gas producers will probably they'll see their revenues go down, but not nearly so dramatically in comparison to those who are producing oil. So let's move on and talk briefly about technologies and modeling. This is something that I know much less about, but engineers out there, I feel is important for you guys to see what's in the study. Here, I guess what surprises me is the relatively small impact of behavioral changes in materials efficiency. I would just intuitively expected that to be greater, but low carbon technologies with active involvement of consumers, of course, does embody behavioral change with the involvement of consumers. And low carbon technologies taking a much bigger share as we go along. So let's just look in brief at some of the technologies and start with hydrogen. Now, this is if you like, is a confusing picture as far as I'm concerned, but essentially what I would say is the big gains for hydrogen seem to be in transport, chemicals and industry, although with shipping, ammonia starts to take over from hydrogen as we get into the 2030s and beyond. You can see that essentially the hydrogen production eventually gets taken over by what is called green hydrogen, in other words, through electrolysis. But there's a significant amount of fossil fuels with CCUS right up to 2050. My take from the IEA scenarios is that really industry, and particularly hard to abate industries, should be the centerpiece of hydrogen, along with some of the transport issues as well. And aviation here looms large, but they see more really aviation being fixed by synthetic fuels rather than necessarily hydrogen. CO2 capture. Now, this is really, I think, a difficult one, and the IEA itself has doubts, which I'll come on to in just a second. But I mean, we now have today about 40 million tons of CO2 being captured. The IEA scenario has getting on for 2 billion tons by 2030, and then going up from there. And there's not much direct air capture in there, so a lot of this is from electricity and industry and fuel supply in general. And you can see in the bottom chart, industrial processes really start to loom large after 2030 as the fossil fuel sector pretty much stabilizes. The IEA has doubts about whether nuclear will even make it to the extent that I showed you in the earlier slides, and whether CCUS will make it. And therefore, it's put forward that if those two do not make it, in the sense that they don't reach the targets I just showed you, then we're looking at a huge additional load on basically solar, PV, wind and batteries. And this, given what already has to happen with those sources, this is going to be a pretty big ask in general. But I think it's good that they've raised the issue that they may fail. So for modelers, here's where the IEA scenario sits in relation to the 400 or so IPCC scenarios. You'll see that they're pretty low on bioenergy. They're very low on energy related, what the CDR, which is basically carbon direct disposal, like direct air capture. They're low on CCUS. They're in the middle for total final consumption, high on hydrogen and high on wind and solar. But I think it's good to have benchmarked this scenario against the ones that the IPCC have put forward. Final section, which I will do quickly because I feel like I'm running out of time, on investment requirements and impacts on households. So you see the immense increase in capital investment requirements, both by sector and by technology. Comparing 2016 with 2020, we're talking about 2.5 times more, and sustaining that pretty much for the next 30 years, and particularly in the electricity sector, and of course also in efficiency and electrification. This shows you in a slightly different format what I've been talking about already. Of course, the switch from fossil fuels into non-fossil and renewable. But I think the grid investment is very, very interesting, which is the bottom two charts, where you see immense increases in grid investment, Most of it, strangely enough, or slightly surprisingly for me, due to just increased demand for electricity, not so much for backing up renewables, although that definitely is an issue, and then of course some general replacement requirements. So finally, this I found, if you like, the most controversial part for me of the whole study. I think a lot of people didn't get to this because it's right at the end. This suggests that in advanced economies, households will see bills falling over the period. In emerging economies, they'll see bills increasing, but as a share of income, not so greatly. I have some significant difficulty seeing this, given that the amount of investment that's required has either got to be paid for by customers or it's got to be paid for by taxpayers. Now, of course, it may be that taxpayers will simply have to foot the bill, but I have great difficulty, given the amount of money that's got to be spent, seeing that household bills are going to stay anywhere near the current situation until, of course, we introduce these technologies, and then things will stabilize and probably decline as technologies improve. But the 2030 situation, both in advanced economies and emerging economies, because things look slightly worse for emerging economies, and the fact that we see energy as a falling share of net disposable income in advanced economies, I think is pretty, how should we say, I think it's a pretty heroic conclusion, and of course, I hope it's right. And with that, I hope I haven't exceeded my time too much. Thank you very much, and look forward to the discussion. And I'm looking for a way to take these slides down. Okay, I should stop sharing in a moment. Okay, back to you guys.
Hi, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Jonathan Stern, for such an insightful keynote speech. And now I would like to turn to Professor Nick Eyre for you to comment on anything touched upon during the speech, or just anything outlined by the IEA report. So 1 sec.
Thank you, Anne-Len, and thank you very much, Jonathan, for such a comprehensive overview of quite a complicated piece of work. I'm not going to try and comment on everything, not surprisingly. Just a few things stand out. I mean, I was struck by that comment from the Saudi minister at the front end, and I know what you say about Middle East oil producers maybe being less affected than other fossil fuel producers. But the bottom line of any net zero strategy is that they're close to phasing out of fossil fuels. And so it is inevitable that fossil fuel producers are not going to like the conclusions. And I very much agree with Jonathan that this study should be treated as how you would get to net zero, not this is going to happen, because whilst I think it's technologically possible to do this, the politics of it are hugely difficult, and maybe we can discuss that in a bit more detail. As Jonathan emphasised, it is one of many potential pathways to net zero, but I think what's becoming clear is that the pathways share quite a lot in common. And one of the perhaps surprising elements to many people is that most of them don't have a huge dependence on carbon capture and storage. They have some, particularly in the later stages, and they don't have a large dependence on nuclear. And in the latter case, it's for two reasons, really. Nuclear has very long timescales. If we're to do anything by 2030, then nuclear is not the answer. Whatever the question is about 2030, more nuclear is not the answer. And also, it is now more expensive than other low carbon, zero carbon power generating technologies. So that just needs to be borne in mind. So I think what we're seeing in all the scenarios is a dramatic upscaling of three things. One is investment in renewables, particularly wind and solar. The second is electrification, from electricity taking, I think, about 20% to 25% of global final demand at the moment to way over 50%, perhaps 70, 80%, depending on the biomass share. And third, energy efficiency, which, given my background, I'll say a bit more about. But I think the critical point is that these three things are not separate. They are linked, because if you're increasingly relying on wind and solar PV, they generate electricity. So if they're to substitute for other energy sources, that can only be done by electrification. So in those end uses like transportation, industry, heating, where we currently use fossil fuels directly, we're going to have to use large amounts of electricity. And the point that is, I think, frequently missed about using electricity is that it can generally be used much more efficiently. Those of you who are engineers will know the second law of thermodynamics and understand very well why you can use electricity more efficiently than combustion fuels. And critically, in this transition, if we're going to electrify transport, we're going to move from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles. If we're going to electrify heating, we're probably going to move from boilers to a technology like heat pumps. And in both cases, those transitions involve an improvement in efficiency of a factor of 3. So that's why we're seeing falling energy demand in this scenario, even though a huge rise in energy services in developing countries, you can still reduce energy demand because the conversion at the point of final energy use is so much more efficient. That's, I think, why there's a relatively low share of what you would call pure behavioral change in this scenario. As Jonathan pointed out, that doesn't mean there's no role for change for consumers or change in end use technology. Indeed, that's absolutely critical to get these changes. If you do assume higher levels of behavioral change are possible, then you can actually get much more substantial reductions. There are scenarios showing 40% reduction in global energy demand, but by 2050, rather than the less than 10% in the IEA scenario. So I just wanted to make that point that almost all of the, or not just the IEA study, but other net zero studies do show a huge growth in renewable energy, energy efficiency, and electrification. And there's a good reason why those all come through together, because they're coupled. We can't do everything with electrification. That's why hydrogen and associated fuels, like perhaps ammonia for marine, are coming through as important parts of the net zero transition by 2050. I think there's a big debate that was flagged in some of those slides that Jonathan showed about whether the hydrogen is coming from the blue route, essentially from fossil fuels with CCS, or the green route, essentially electrification, whether one happens first and the other later. I think we're seeing very different strategies in different countries. Germany, for example, very focused on going straight to green hydrogen. UK seeing a much bigger route for blue hydrogen. think this is partly to do with the effect of where fossil fuel companies are strong. I think we will see a bigger focus on blue hydrogen where the lobbying power and the existing employment in fossil fuels is higher. So just to end by a comment on that point that Jonathan made about being surprised by falling energy costs for consumers in developed countries in this scenario. I think I'm less surprised, Jonathan. That's because of this sort of threefold reduction in energy demand that you get with converting to electric heating and electric vehicles. And even though electricity is going to be a more expensive fuel than fossil fuels, it's unlikely to be 3 times as expensive on those timescales. I think there's perhaps a bit of sleight of hand here, because you said you can't, Jonathan, that you can't believe that this will be good, as good for consumers as it implies. And I think you're right, but what's happening is that the additional expenditure by consumers is in capital expenditure for more expensive heating systems, for insulation, for more expensive vehicles, with a saving in the energy cost. So it doesn't necessarily mean that if consumer energy bills are falling, consumer costs as a whole are falling for all the equipment that's needed for the transition. I think I'll leave it there. I've probably had my time. Be interested to see what other colleagues have to say. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Eyre. I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Colin Nolan for his perspective.
Hi there. Thank you for this invitation, firstly. Secondly, what I was going to do, I was going to respond more directly to some of the questions that were sent to us in advance of this presentation, specifically the ones about changing skills in job markets. So one of the questions that were posed to us was, what does this report entail in terms of future opportunities for people interested in supporting net zero efforts? And this question encompasses a sub-question relating to the STEM subjects and engineers, and another one more focused on the social sciences. So the STEM question is, what do you think our impact or would compare between going into the industry to help with the implementation of net zero strategies, or staying in academia to strive for achieving game-changing technologies and innovations? Now, this, of course, is a very tricky question. As somebody who is in academia, but at the same time straddles the academic and industrial divide, I'd like to see the brightest sparks, of course, retaining some foothold in academia, at the same time contributing to decarbonisation in industry. So I, for example, have done this by working for industry. So I've worked for an energy efficiency agency as a social scientist, but I've also now taken an academic pathway, and I still retain a foothold in industry by sitting on boards of, by being a director on a board of directors, and also providing a strategic guidance and advice. And this kind of knowledge transfer, I think, will be very important moving forward. And this is also increasingly recognized by government. For example, there's the knowledge transfer network, and there's various knowledge transfer partnerships between industry and academia, which foster the exchange of ideas between industry and academia. And this enables the living lab kind of perspective to be put into practice, where technologies, for example, that might seem to produce good results in labs, for example, can be tested in a more realistic setting, where organizational and institutional factors can also be taken into account on the road to commercialization and the development of routes to market. And I think this is a key area where researchers and people being educated in the area of science, technology, engineering, and maths could really benefit from, is how great ideas, game-changing technologies and innovations can actually move from something which is promising in a lab setting into a real life setting, where all the messiness of the real world needs to be factored in, and how the various pressures and, for example, legacy systems, skill sets and lack thereof, financial flows and so on, well, if you like, they entangle to produce certain outcomes or to lock out other outcomes. And this is something which I think is also something which might have been downplayed in the IEA report, and which is also maybe something what the initial comment by the Saudi person in the Financial Times was alluding to, that there's locked-in systems which are actually very good at doing what they're doing. And they work very efficiently at producing outcomes. And currently these outcomes are very high carbon. And to change these underlying systems requires more than just a technologically more efficient, possibly even more cost-effective approach, because there's many other factors that we need to take into account to displace systems or to force technological substitution. For example, where if we look at the Saudi oil industry, which has traditionally always produced energy with one of the highest energy returns on energy invested, which means it's actually one of the best ways that we can get hold of energy. To replace any of these really efficient energy resources in terms of energy returns on energy investment, we require a huge amount of institutional and organizational change. So this is something which I think the STEM researchers and students certainly would benefit from. Now, regarding social scientists and people from the humanities, including people like me, I think there is an increasing understanding that social scientists and people from the humanities can contribute significantly to this understanding. And there's, I just highlight one example of how it can contribute to our understanding of how energy is used and consumed. So there's one area which is called social practice theory, which understands our world as a series of social practices that, for example, we have the social practice of showering, often in the morning, and traditionally of commuting to work. And it's these social practices which pretty much determine the energy demand in our economy. So, for example, we have an energy demand curve which rises very steeply, like in the morning, and then it drops down a bit in the afternoon, and then rises. It drops down in the morning, rises again at noon, drops in the afternoon, rises in the evening. And this is all because of these social practices. And to understand how social practices emerge and how they can change could play a very significant role in these behavior change assumptions, as in driving down energy demand through changing behavior. And I think I've already overshot, so I'm just going to leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Nolan. So I think our next panelist is Dr. Catherine Collett, so I will hand over to her.
Thanks, Saffron, and thank you, Jonathan, Nick and Colin. I just wanted to pick up in my few minutes on 3 main points. So that are mentioned and have already been discussed slightly, but just to draw our attention to those. So the first is that reducing our energy emissions to net zero will not be sufficient for net zero entirely. So in order to mitigate climate change, we need to reach net zero across the whole of our society. And that is alluded to within the IEA report. But for those of you who haven't yet read it, you might have missed that. And so although we might be able to reduce our emissions associated with the production of, say, cement or steel, we actually use coal in the chemical process of creating both cement and steel. And so the use, the emissions that come from chemical manufacturing processes are another challenge entirely. And we must really focus on those. And that's one of the reasons why hydrogen is kind of quite high in demand in this scenario, in this pathway, because hydrogen can be used to replace some of these processes so that they can become net zero. And also why CCUS is important in the future. The CCUS is not all associated with emissions from energy generation. Some of those emissions are associated with products and their production. And I think that's a really important point to remember, that in the report they say energy accounts for 75% of emissions, global emissions. And so the other 25% are still really important. And this report does a good job if you go into the details of understanding how other emissions might be able to be avoided. The second point I wanted to make is that this is a global problem. And I think this comes back to potentially some of the skepticism around whether the report could be realistic or not. From a high income country perspective, a lot of the assumptions made within the report could be considered realistic. No electric vehicles on the road by being sold, no internal combustion engines being sold for private cars by 2035. That could be realistic. And, in the UK, that will be the reality. If you then go and look at a developing country, is that going to be quite possible? Will they have the infrastructure available to them in order to charge these electric vehicles? And would they also be able to afford them when, we as high income country citizens struggle to see the appeal of switching over? And I think that that's something we must really try and remember, is that this is global, and that we in high income countries have a kind of a responsibility to try and ensure that the research and development that we're doing is kind of looking at the global picture and able to support those in developing countries by developing cheaper, affordable and context appropriate technologies. So, and the third point I wanted to make is that about climate change is a global good, and therefore it needs to have political support. It's a common good to mitigate climate change. That means that we need a huge amount of international and global political will to make this happen. Now, behavioural change in the IEA report, 75% of that is coming from political incentives or kind of regulations. And that's both domestic and for companies. And just recognising that needs to be applied across the whole of the global society is going to be one of the biggest international political challenges I think we're going to have in the coming decades. And we need to work together. There's an analogy with the COVID vaccines, no one's safe until we're all safe. And it can almost be seen that way for climate change. We're all in this together and need to support each other as much as we can. And that includes support for business to enable them to kind of invest at a low risk to their investment. So therefore, policy has a big role in making sure that the pathways are determined in advance so that businesses globally, small businesses in different parts of the world are all able to invest and conduct R&D and put money into their companies and scaling up of their services without the kind of with a lower risk to their investment, by knowing that the government will be backing them. So those are my 3 points. And I'll just hand back over to Saffron.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And I believe we have one final panelist left. So this will be Dr. Sivapriya Bhagavati to present her views. Thank you. I will just add her now.
Hi, everyone. Hope you can hear me all right. And so I'd actually start with reiterating what John said in the very beginning, that this is, or whatever scenarios is not exactly a forecast. A forecast is when you know whatever we know today, and then forecast that with a 10% plus or minus 10% confidence that is what is going to happen in the future. Whereas if we look at whatever we know and include all the uncertainties, we have multiple futures which we can look at. And that is exactly a scenario planning. And most of the confusions or most of the questions that are being asked, my as well as what John said, is that it's because people are not realizing that it's a scenario, not forecast. So that is the first thing that I wanted to clarify. And in terms of my expertise, it's more on whatever has been happening in the UK and also in the city sector. So I'll keep my comments to those sector. The scenarios that the IEA report mentions is the first one is the stated policy scenario, which takes into account like whatever specific policies are already in place, and that will eventually result in 2.7 degrees of temperature rise above the pre-industrial times. Whereas if we assume that every national net zero pledges are achieved on time and on full, then also we will be left with a 2.1 degrees temperature rise, which is not sufficient again. So then we go on to look at, okay, we want that to be limited to 1.5. So what should be achieved, or what are the things that could be done or need to be done to achieve that? That is the scenario that this report discusses in detail, which is the net zero emissions scenario. In terms of the electricity sector, the report talks about that 20% of the electric vehicle stock would, 20% of the car stock in the world would be electric by 2030. Which to me feels a bit less ambitious, because the internal combustion engine vehicles have a life of about 20-30 years easily. So if we still have 80% of the vehicles as internal combustion engine vehicles, then it becomes like we are stuck with that. It would be really hard to eliminate that in the future. And the other is the discussion about the heat pumps, where we are talking about like 600 million heat pumps to be installed by 2030. From the work that I've done for UK in terms of the heat pump, the cost of heat pumps is almost 10 times that of a gas boiler, which we currently use. So it is quite hard to say to the people like, okay, it's fine, we want to reduce the emissions, so you would replace your gas boiler with something that is 10 times as expensive. And in terms of the operational cost, your electricity cost is also higher than the gas. So there is a bit of gap in terms of how do we promote the adoption of heat pumps when we have a big gap in the capital investment that has to go into individual houses. So one of the other suggestion people are talking about is the hydrogen boiler, which I think was highlighted on the heat strategy report that the UK government released yesterday, to say hydrogen boilers would replace it. But the challenges associated with hydrogen boilers are even worse, and that to me, each challenge is an opportunity in itself. So the opportunity or challenge in the hydrogen heat pumps are the boilers currently, that even though the companies are producing hydrogen-enabled boilers, these are only capable of handling up to 20% hydrogen. So 80% is still going to be LPG or methane, which would mean that even if we have those hydrogen boilers in place, to completely hydrogenate it or to completely 100% hydrogen, it's still a longer time, and it's still like a different boiler altogether. So that differentiation is something which we should remember when we are talking about it. In terms of the next key milestone that the report talks about is the renewable energy generation, and we want like 60% of electricity generation coming from renewables. That's an ambitious target, and I feel that's kind of like achievable. We should be looking for it. One of the challenges that come in when we have that much renewables is that renewables are location specific as well. Yes, it's intermittent, but that can be easily addressed by the flexibility of just demand as well as using storage, which could be either short-term or long-term storage. But the locational aspect of the generation, especially if we look at UK alone, there is a lot of wind in the north of Scotland and a lot of sun in the Cornwall or the southwest region. But the Midlands is where you have maximum demand. So you need the transmission capability in addition to the flexibility to be able to have achieving a global net zero or a globally transparent way of using the energy. So I think one of the last bullet points that I would like to cover is that hydrogen is kind of showcased as like the silver bullet or panacea for everything. But as already mentioned in the discussions today, hydrogen is suitable for some applications and hydrogen is not cost effective for some. So just assuming that hydrogen would eventually be able to solve every single problem that we are currently facing is not a good way to proceed. And some of the discussions are so skewed because that enables the idea that hydrogen can do all this in the future, makes the incumbents, especially the gas and oil and gas incumbents, to continue using their assets without having to worry about their assets. That's it. And
thank you very much, Priya, for a very insightful response to the keynote speech and IEA report. Now we'll move on to the pre-planned question section. So I'll add all speakers back to the stream, and then we'll address some of the questions collectively. Okay, so the first questions I would like to ask is regarding a just energy transition. So many of you have mentioned the global, how the global connectedness of energy transition and how it's important to be a global effort. So how can we ensure that this will be or at least strive for a just energy transition? So how will limiting the use of fossil fuel in developing countries disadvantage them? And if so, how can we avoid it? What incentives, regulations, or support are required for encouraging the uptake of renewable energy in these countries? So if we like, we can go in reverse order. So start with Priya, if you would like to say something about that.
So in terms of the just transition, I can comment from the UK's perspective in that there is a significant percentage of UK population which is still considered fuel poor. So there is that aspect. So I think it was kind of surprising for me to learn that even in a developed country like UK, we still have like 25% of the population which is considered fuel poor, and that they have to be supported in this transition. So I can only say in terms of the developing countries' perspective, the approach that we should take is more of a needs-based one, where we look at what is the need of that society and then try to address that aspect, rather than trying to say, we, the developed countries, have come up with this wonderful smart product and we then go and sell it down to them. It doesn't work. One, there is a significant difference on what their expectations of the technology is, and also in terms of the sheer volume. Like having tested in a city in London is not equivalent to kind of putting that solution across to a city in India, because of the sheer volume of population. Having tested 100, you can't just go in and yes, please use it, because the sheer volume will just crash your system. So that difference has to be highlighted, and before we just go in and say this is the solution.
Okay, thank you so much. I saw Catherine nodding during when you were speaking. So Catherine, would you like to add something?
Yeah, sure. I think when we talk about developing countries, I guess it really comes down to the finance and the cost as well. Building on what Priya said, it needs to be the appropriate solution. But then after that, it really needs to be cost effective. And there are two important things that kind of the high income countries can do with, for example, R&D really allows the cost of technologies to fall. So you can reduce the capital costs by investing in R&D that is both appropriate for often high income applications and also for lower middle income countries. For example, with this, solar panels, a lot of the demand has been over in high income countries, and that's helped with the price really fall. And the same with batteries for electric vehicles. The price of batteries have come down 90% in the last 10 years. So that sort of concept on both of those technologies are very relevant. And then secondly, the cost of capital investment, by enabling governments to reduce the cost of loans in their countries, etc., you really enable entrepreneurship within countries. And at the moment, a lot of countries have very high cost of capital. So mechanisms to reduce that. Now, I'm not an economist, but I know that there are options for trying to reduce the cost of loans. And having said, so those are my kind of two mechanisms for financing, but I think there's another point to remember, that there are a lot of opportunities in developing countries as well. Many developing countries have great solar resource, and therefore they would be, your cost per kilowatt hour of solar could be really cheap if the capital cost of solar become really cheap. You have a lot of electron potential from the photons hitting the Earth's surface in those areas. And secondly, for example, in India, you use motorbike taxis a lot, and they have a smaller electric battery, and therefore they have a smaller kind of battery need, and therefore they're cost cheaper to buy. And there's great opportunities there. And they're one of the first vehicles, modalities that in the report is fully converted to electric sales. And there have been lots of popular vehicles because it's cheaper to run an electric motorbike than it is to run a conventional motorbike. So it makes sense financially. And I think that that's really like the linchpin, is making it make sense financially for the people in this country.
Okay, thank you very much. The other speakers, Colin, Nick, or Jonathan, would you like to add anything to that?
I can go next. So I think it would be important for first world countries to actually step up to their pledge, which I think was made in 2009 in Copenhagen, to provide $100 billion, I think, to emerging economies to address climate change. So I think that would be a very, very good start. And we haven't seen anywhere near this commitment actually coming through. And as we've seen in the UK with foreign aid, and the share of foreign aid investment going down from 0.7 of GDP to 0.5, I think we're actually seeing a very disappointment development at the moment, where money's actually drying up for these much needed investments in emerging economies. So another area, which is what I alluded to earlier on, is it's about skills and supply chains. So the key areas where, for example, we might see a particular lock-in around a particular technology has often something to do with the skills and supply chains that are available in particular economies. For example, where vehicles are powered by diesel engines and so are diesel generators, the same skill set can repair both, can sort out the supply chain, can find fuel. And this is very much a locked in energy system that we often find in emerging economies. To break this cycle would take a huge amount of effort in terms of skills and organization capacity, but also supply chains to even facilitate a local transition to different fuels. So it probably needs to start in the educational sector, to develop the electrical skills that we need moving forward to electrify sources of power and to encourage a transition away from fossil fuels.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that kind of leads into our next question. So we kind of talk about that from a very macro perspective. So now taking it a bit smaller to individuals. So like, what can people do to help with energy transition? I've seen that one audience question that we have is from Clarinda saying that she has 3 years until graduate, but it seems that we have so little time left. What can young engineers do while the world is going downhill? I don't want to regret anything. So what can people do? Do you have any advice for people that are going into industry, they're students in university? Which sectors should they focus on? How does it compare going to industry to actually help with implementation compared to maybe staying in academia to try to get those cutting edge research done? So, and that applies to both the STEM subject and also in humanity and social sciences. Nick, would you like to take this one first?
Yeah, I'll just actually say something about the underpinning assumption here that there is so little time left and everything has to be done now. Yeah, we need rapid action, but this is about changing the whole global economy, the whole of its energy, transportation and building sectors. Sorry, it's not going to happen quickly. It's going to actually take most of the lifetime of most of the people on this call. It's certainly going to extend beyond my lifetime. So whilst it's important to think about urgency, actually this is about a long-term transition, major changes, job opportunities for a very large number of people in a very large number of sectors for a very long time. And whilst we should take the 1.5 challenge seriously, we shouldn't. I think there is a risk of people getting too hung up on 1.5. 1.5 is worse than 1.4 and it's better than 1.6 and it's better than 1.7, but there's nothing magic about 1.5. It was just plucked out of the air in Paris. Every bit of climate mitigation we can do matters and is important, and we're going to go on needing to do it for at least 30 years, which is a large part of people's working lifetimes. So yeah, do look at it as part of the world that we're all going to have to live in, rather than something that needs to be done in the next 2 years.
Yeah, so every single bit counts. I would like to turn to Jonathan. Would you like to add anything, maybe regarding the oil and gas industry?
I think for this question and the last one, I think what I'm looking for is a mindset change, and that is almost whatever sector you're going into, whether it's academia or industry or indeed politics, you need a change of mindset. And I think there's a slight problem I find that in what I call rich Europe, we already have this mindset. I mean, whether or not we're doing it, we have the mindset. There are very few people who are arguing, oh, we don't need to do this, or it's not at the top of the agenda. The problem is when you go outside rich Europe or rich countries in general, which when I was able to travel, I used to do quite often. And I just want to give you one example, because Colin, in his introduction, he mentioned Saudi Arabia, and we've done a lot of work in the Gulf. A couple of years ago, we did a book on natural gas, future of natural gas in the Gulf, and we assembled a whole bunch of people from Gulf countries, and they were all talking about, oh well, it's such a big problem, we can't produce enough natural gas for power generation. You're like, well, why are you? I mean, you live in the countries that have got the most sun in the world. Why aren't you doing solar and to some extent wind? And it's like, because they've got all these documents saying they're going to do these wonderful things. So why isn't this happening? And yeah, nobody would say it around the table, but in the coffee break, they all come up to me and said, well, whoever became important in our country working on solar and wind, you've got to work on oil and gas to be an important person. And this is something that I think is, from a social science perspective, is terribly important. These sectors have got to become politically important in major countries. Because from an economic, it's not economics, from an economics, absolute no-brainer to be doing solar. In the UAE, it is actually beginning to happen. But in other countries, either there's nothing much happening, or they've got these very grandiose plans, but when you inquire, nothing much is happening there. And I think you see that to a lesser extent in other places. I mean, I tend to work in big countries like, for example, Russia, I was on a call with sort of a big conference with very important Russian companies, and their reaction to Shell being told you've got to reduce your oil and gas production was, oh goody, that means we can increase our oil and gas production. And it's just, you know, the mindset change wherever you live in the world has got to be, you know, very, very substantial if the people who are powerful, either in powerful corporations or in governments, are going to make these changes.
Okay, just following up on that thread. So, do you think that's going to change anytime soon? And do you think maybe the recently released IEA report and also the recent IPCC report that says like we have to totally end fossil fuel use, do you think that will encourage more people to change mindset and then maybe like give that a push?
What I mean, I think there's really two ways for me this is going to happen. One is electorally. You know, we have to get more people who are going to vote for politicians who are going to do this. And I see this happening because, and again, a lot of the countries I go to, they don't talk about climate change specifically, but they talk about, you know, heat waves or Arctic melt or things that come from climate change, but they don't necessarily recognize that as climate change. Or rather, they don't recognize that the problems are about climate change. But I'm not sure that documents, I'm a researcher, so I'm all for documents. I'm not sure that documents per se change minds, but what I think what happens is that events, flooding, super heat waves where people die, sadly enough, things where people often lose their lives, those kind of things change minds. They promote electoral change. And what the documents do is to demonstrate this is why it's happening.
Thank you very much. So to Priya, Catherine, and Colin, would you like to add anything, whether regarding the urgency of change and the entire structural mindset change, or just what should people do for especially university students?
Sorry, can I just?
Sorry, Colin.
No, you go first.
Sorry, it just is following on from what John just said, that it's just not a priority for many people. The climate change is just not a priority, or acting on it just not a priority. But it's just not the rich people or rich European countries or the oil and gas, but it's the most underdeveloped and developing countries where the population or their first immediate need is food on the table. So if you are saying that, you can buy electricity or you can cook food, but cooking food would mean that you are going to use wood or you are going to use a fuel which is not clean. The first choice, there is absolutely no choice. They will go for the food and they will go for a non-clean option because they really don't have a choice. So to have this rich country's perspective of saying, yes, this is the first and important thing to do, but going to their lives and saying that it is their day-to-day challenges that matter to them more. It's not just about the whole world, because one, the developed countries have exploited all these developing countries and underdeveloped countries over centuries to exploit to an extent where there is nothing left in those countries. And now we are still going to them and saying that because you are polluting or because you're aspiring to become a bit more developed and get some comfort in life, we don't want you to do that. That doesn't work. So it's not just the mindset. It's also about yes, these are the people who will be worst pinned in case of a climate change as well. They will feel the most droughts. They are already significant water scarcities. They are struggling to get even a 3 to 4 hour electricity a day. And it's not a single solution. We just can't sit in an office and say that that's how the world should operate. It's much more politically different. But one thing which they have as an advantage is the agility, the speed at which things change in the developing countries. Especially in many African countries, the things moved from no telephone connection to directly mobile phones. So they skipped an entire era of landlines. So, the agility within which things can move, if they are cost effective and that it improves their life, then things move much quicker. In the same way, in India also, there was a significant change when the internet was introduced, and now people don't carry cash anymore in most of the places. They just use their mobile phones to pay. And that transition was much quicker in India than what I saw in UK. It took COVID to move into a cash-free society in UK, but the move was much more faster back in India. So it is the agility with which people move. So we say that the technology and skills are required, technology skill sets are changing, but they are much more faster in adapting to things, as long as we kind of convince that it is effective, it is cost effective, it can improve their life, it can lead them to lead a more respectable life than you are in, or people are into that. And the last question is about the academia versus industry. So I have only recently moved to industry from the academia. So I feel the opportunities are equal in that from the academia, you can do cutting edge. From the industry, you can push that cutting edge into the lives of the people. So there is a difference. And if you are, so it depends on your individual strengths. If you are more towards getting things implemented, then maybe you better fit with a different part of the world than in the academia. But if you are somewhere between an innovation projects, you also have the opportunity to innovate as well as to get it implemented. So it's more of where you feel your skills fit rather than to say where exactly is the impact, because impact is possible in either place.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so just moving on to Colin, but before that, I'd like to remind everyone that we are almost running out of time. We have received many audience questions as well. So if we can quickly move through this one, and then we'll go to the audience questions, so audience won't be disappointed. Okay, over to you, Colin.
So this is just following on from Jonathan's point, but also linking to what Priya said. But even though people might be in generally more understanding of climate change, we also have to understand that there is an increasing fear of climate-induced migration. And we're seeing that in countries like Italy, where countries like the Brothers of Italy and Forza Italia are heading the polls and look like they'll be getting over 50% of the vote. And we're talking about nativist and fascist parties rising to power in countries which feel like immigration is an increasing threat. And with warming climate, we're likely to see more of that. So even though we, on the one hand, might see the voters increasingly aware of the consequences of climate change, there's also people are aware of the consequences of climate change in terms of migration and what that might have on their countries. And if this is perceived as a threat to national security, people will vote for right-wing parties who are less likely to pursue a green agenda. So I'm not as optimistic as Jonathan on that point.
Okay. So if we can move on to audience questions, if that's okay. So firstly, we have this question from Paul Swarsott. So this is directed towards Catherine and Nick about speed limits. So is there any research carried on reduction in demand for electricity and charging infrastructure that will result from lowering the national speed limit to 50 miles per hour? So that I think relates to a previous question we have received during the pre-submitted section. So about how the European Energy Commissioner has said that they welcome a continent-wide 50 miles per hour limit from the International Energy Agency, so lowering this to reduce demand by 30%, given the need to share renewable electric power between transport, heating, and manufacturing. So either of you, yeah.
Katie, do you want to go first? Or shall
I can, but I might be disappointing. So, Nick, if you've got something more to say, then please feel free.
So I haven't got any exact numbers in my head. Clearly, reducing speed limits does reduce energy consumption, and indeed, the whole history of lower speed limits, both in Europe and the US, was driven during the period of the oil crises in the 70s, which probably only Jonathan and I on this call are old enough to remember. Whether that's as true for electrified vehicles is I think I mean, technically, the air resistance is the big driver of that. So I would guess the same effect would apply to electric vehicles, but it's a relatively small compared to the benefits that you get from electrification and from the other changes you can do in transportation, which are in modal shift to active modes of transport and to public transport. So yeah, it might help, and it actually might encourage a shift to public transport, of course, if you slow down the rate at which cars can move on motorways.
Yeah.
But it's all these things are political issues, not technical ultimately.
I think something to add to this is as Nick said, one of the big factors is air resistance, and so a reduced speed limit may have a larger impact for freight than it would do for a passenger vehicle, which is also something interesting to consider. But one big point is that when you switch to an electric vehicle, you go from something like a 45% efficient drivetrain, which an internal combustion engine has. So of all of the energy inside the petrol you put in your car, 40% of that is useful. Whereas in an electric vehicle, you have something like a 90% efficient drivetrain. So of all the electricity you put in, you're going to be able to use kind of between 80 to 90% of that energy. And that in itself is such a big conversion that it helps with your real energy efficiency. And so although lowering the speed limit might help a little bit more, you're already getting a big change in terms of your energy efficiency from using an electric vehicle. That's not something we've discussed yet, so I thought I'd just mention that.
Thank you very much indeed.
Sorry, can I just add? So in the Netherlands, they recently introduced a speed limit of 100 kilometers per hour on their motorways. So you could do, if you like a living lab comparison of the Netherlands and the surrounding countries, which don't have such a speed limit.
Great to know. Thank you. So the next one is probably targeted more towards Jonathan. So with like natural gas, liquefied natural gas peak, would it also happen around 2030-ish as presented in your presentation, even with the rise of blue hydrogen?
I think the answer is yes, because blue hydrogen there's a lot of hype around hydrogen in general and blue hydrogen in particular. And the problem with blue hydrogen, or one of the problems, is we've yet to see CCS develop to the extent that it would need to in order to really make a major difference. But it really depends on how that carbon sequestration works out, what the costs of it are, and what the politics of it are. What I would say is that the LNG industry is not seeing the peak of LNG anywhere around this decade, and it's still investing in huge and very costly projects. And if the peak is correct, then there's going to be a lot of stranded LNG assets around in the next decade.
Okay, and another question's kind of related to the oil and gas industry. So this basically asks about like the mental shift that you talked about and the supportive policy. So why do so few politicians and leaders understand tech, and how can we change this?
Well, I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer this, but let me just say my concern with politicians, I'm not sure whether they do or they don't understand tech, but they appear to be locked into a mindset in many countries that anything that is going to increase household bills or energy bills is going to impact their electoral chances. And that, I think, unless we can change that mindset, then we're going to have a problem. But I'm not sure I want to comment on whether politicians understand technology or not.
What about we kind of frame it in different ways? So how can politicians better support this kind of technology and the transition? So how can this mindset within the greater community be changed? If anyone else wants to take this.
Well, can I just say something? I think actually that politicians, they love technology, especially big technology, and they love cutting ribbons in front of something really shiny and big. And that is one of the big problems. So a bit of my research focuses on comparing energy demand and energy supply solutions. And energy demand solutions on average appear to receive less policy-making attention than energy supply solution. And that's because if you reduce something, it's very difficult to cut a ribbon in front of it. So there tends to be a focus on technological fixes, on especially big, flashy, shiny, huge technologies. But if you look at the 10-point plan by the Prime Minister here in the UK, it's 40 gigawatts of offshore wind and stuff, which is all very important. But there's lots of other things that need to change to achieve net zero. So arguably, there is too much a focus on technology among politicians rather than on the really important point of, well, behavior change and so on, which the others here have mentioned.
Okay. Would anyone else add to what Colin has said, or just anything towards policy and then just the changes? Oh, okay, we'll move on to the next one. So this one is by Paul. So what is hindering the uptake of green hydrogen production by electrolysis using renewable electricity? And what could accelerate its adoption? Thank you. So would anyone, maybe Priya or Catherine, would like to take this one?
So I only read the hydrogen strategy report today, and in there they quote the cost of green hydrogen production from electrolysis is 3 times the cost of production through methane reformation, including the cost of carbon capture and sequestration. So I clearly have no idea how they arrived at that cost, because to me that feels a bit too expensive, and that's not what I was expecting because of all the discussion so far about the hype of hydrogen. I was thinking that if it is to be from the renewable energy, and instead of getting curtailed, you are going to use that into hydrogen production, then it should in the end come cheaper. But this UK's strategy report says that it's 3 times, and even by 2050, it would have just reached parity with each other. But that seems a bit unrealistic to me. So if anybody wants to comment on that.
Yeah, I think sorry, was Nick,
Go
was
on,
that
Katie.
you? No, I was going to say,
go on.
I think it's the cost of electricity is a big concern, and also the cost of electrolyzers. But when these calculations are done with electricity, they are often not considering the fact that you could soak up electricity that would otherwise be curtailed. So, for example, in Kenya, there's a huge surplus of geothermal energy that's produced, and it kind of it's not used at the moment. And for example, hydrogen production in a green hydrogen production in a place like that could be a really good use of that energy at a low cost. So that's one thing. And then on the other hand, with the blue hydrogen, so with the CCUS, my concern is that perhaps the cost of storage is not necessarily being calculated as kind of as high as it should be. And I don't know if what Nick's gonna talk about, but I feel as if we may be surprised by the cost of green hydrogen, and also it being lower than its forecast, and the cost of blue hydrogen being higher than its forecast in the future. Sorry, Nick. I don't know.
Yeah, I broadly agree with that. I think we need to reduce both the electricity cost and the electrolyzer cost to address the issue that Priya pointed out. Electrolyzer cost, I think, will come down in the way that we've seen for solar and batteries if we expand production, and we need to probably expand production at least 100-fold to get to these sorts of numbers. So that's plausible. And yeah, what is the electricity cost that you are using? Because if electricity is free, which is what the situation of it's curtailed, then it's actually very cheap. And so the economics of this will change a lot as we move towards systems with very high levels of variable renewables like wind and solar, and the hours a year in which very cheap electricity is available increase. At the moment, they aren't enough to generate green hydrogen. So I would say hydrogen production and use will be the last stage of the transition after we've gone through the shift to renewables and then the shift to electrification of the things we can electrify.
Okay. Thank you very much. So I think we have to reach the end of this session. Thank you very much to all the speakers for such an insightful discussion and such an engaging session. We have received many questions, and we apologize if we didn't get to answer your questions during this session. If you have any questions, please feel free to just forward that to us, or just to the speakers directly. So on the screen, I will share the so one sec, on the screen, I'll share the contact details of our speakers. So if you like to screenshot that, or just make a note of any questions you have and send it to any speakers, I think they'll be happy to answer your questions. Alternatively, feel free to email Oxford Energy Society or European Young Engineers for any questions you have. So thank you very much to all the speakers, and then also to our keynote speaker, and also thank you so much to all the audience for attending. Thank you very much on behalf of Oxford Energy Society and European Young Engineers. And yeah, we hope you have a great day, and see you next time. Bye.
Bye.